itself. The race, or the inner bearing, actually rests. If I can get this on here, this is a tight fit. But the bearing, you can see, the bearing is in here. This is what spins. There's no friction point against the kingpin itself. This is what spins. So there's no friction point. This thing, you got one at the top. I've actually got it upside down. But you got one at the top and one at the bottom. If I can get that in there, that is really tight. There we go. You got one at the top and one at the bottom, just like on the cup and needle bearings. The big thing here is, look at how that is angled, or tapered, as we said. So what happens is, when you put the load, pushing down on the load, which is what's happening here, the bearings are accepting the load, albeit angular. They're accepting the load. This bearing, there's no load acceptance here. None. There's no way that bearing can accept any kind of load. So the load is on the housing and the kingpin. Where here, it's on the kingpin, but it's on the bearing. And it prevents the bearing from wearing out, and then hence wearing against the kingpin, and then busting out of the housing itself. You've got to do absolutely zero maintenance for a very long time for this to fail to the degree that that has. Because you've got several layers of protection before it would actually damage the axle housing itself, the casting. These, indeed, are more expensive, but it's a far better design than this right here. Does everybody agree with that? You guys understand what I'm telling you? Tony's got a comment, I can tell.
How often do you recommend greasing?
Well, we do. Our PM schedule is every 250 hours. So the other side of it is as Tony just asked about greasing. You've got a grease fitting on the top and on the bottom, and then you've got one here and here on the draw link. One thing about tapered roller bearings versus a needle bearing is because the tolerances are so tight, grease has a tendency to cake, especially if it gets any kind of debris or whatever in it. It becomes hard and sometimes even brittle. The pressure required to push the grease through there and down around the kingpin and then into the bearing itself against the kingpin is pretty great. And the older it is and the dirtier the environment, such as that one right there, the harder it is. That's probably why that one failed, because they couldn't get grease in there to lubricate it. This one, you'll notice the way this bearing's designed, you've got a lot greater gaps and you've got a lot more room. And this bearing will take grease a lot easier than a needle bearing will. So maintenance is easier, and longevity is much, much greater. Much greater. The tools in this sales briefcase are simple ones, but if you have limited knowledge of the mechanics of a lift truck and how it works, I can sit here and show these to you all day long, but you don't really understand what they mean or how they work or what they're for. But with having the toolbox with the truck and demonstrating where they go and how they fit and how they work makes all the difference in the world. That's why that little kit right there is so important. If you use it properly, it'll sell trucks for you. It'll sell trucks for you. The other thing about the steer axle on our truck versus the other guys is the articulation point. Forklift 101, right? You got A, B, and C. It's a triangle on the bottom. It's a pyramid. And then you come up to the point, right? The point back here is articulation point on the steer axle. Many, many manufacturers over the years have struggled with that point because of the design of the bushings and so forth, and the accessibility to actually grease it and make it last. What we did many years ago, we came up with what's called a silent block mount. And it's kind of a polyurethane kind of material. It's not like a true rubber, but you've got a big pin that comes off the main chassis, and that polyurethane block, it goes around that pin, and then it's secured into the housing of the steer axle itself. So it actually articulates on that polyurethane. So there's no metal-to-metal contact whatsoever. But that's what it works off of. Silent block, meaning it doesn't make any noise. Years ago, especially when they had the old bell crank steering systems on lift trucks, you had some type of metal bushing, maybe brass or whatever, that required a great deal of lubrication back there. And when they weren't lubricated properly, every time that axle articulated, it would squeak and creak and make a lot of noise. Hence the name silent block. We've been doing it that way for a lot of years, and we have zero issues with them. Requires no lubrication, no maintenance whatsoever. So between the tapered roller bearings, the size of the kingpins, design of the mount itself, you got something to talk about. Not to mention, in particular, when you're talking about a cushion tire truck, the actual physical size of the steer axle versus your competitor's cushion, because it is much bigger than theirs, for sure. And steer axles, as I said, in a cushion tire environment are very, very important. Very important. So to kind of recap, let's talk about the handful of particulars. Offset drive axle, full floating, wheel gears, gear reduction at the hub, wet disc brakes, right? Larger kingpin, tapered roller bearings, circuit breaker behind the control valve, transmission isolation with the U-joint connection between it and the drive axle, double element air cleaner with a vacuum indicator, handful of things. Suspension seat, deck mounted controls. There's all kinds of ways to separate yourself from your competitors. These are the things that's important for you to talk about when you're doing a demo, when you're competing against, doesn't matter who it is. Don't be afraid to compete against anybody. This is a very good product. It will compete with anybody out there. But if you don't give it an honest chance, you'll fail. But if you do, I promise you, you will succeed. Not every time, but you will succeed. Okay? Any questions about what we talked about?
On that air filter, you hit the reset button. Our technicians are not going to reset it when they do the PM, correct? They reset it once they've installed a new filter.
Well, yeah, you don't, well, if it's indicating any level of vacuum and they don't replace the filter, even if they hit the reset button, just as soon as they start the engine back up and it gets used, it's going to go back to that same indication. So it's a simple reset. I do that. I do what I did to demonstrate how it works, because by basically clogging this up, I effectively led it to believe that the air filter was clogged up. Is what I did. But yeah, it doesn't. If it needs to be changed and they don't change it, it's going to indicate yet again. But so if they change the filter, they do need to push that button, because it will not reset automatically if it's showing a vacuum on there. Any other questions?
Is that hooked up to the computer at all that shows any kind of warning?
No.
On the dash?
No. The only kind of warnings that you'll get on this truck is overheat on the engine or the transmission, or low oil on the engine or the transmission. You'll get an indication on this thing, and if it goes to extreme, it'll shut it down.
Okay. Those are options, correct? They're not standard.
No, it's standard.
Is it standard?
Standard.
The one that's an option that could be important, especially in a big warehouse, we learned this at LG, is the fuel indicator.
Okay.
They specifically said they had a problem.
Low LP is optional.
Okay, I thought
If somebody's in a 1 million square foot building and they're on one end and they run out because they didn't know they were low, they gotta walk the length of the building, and it's a problem. So that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Over temp and low oil engine and transmission is standard on LPG trucks. If we're talking about pneumatic diesel, you've got overheat and low oil on engine only. It's optional on the transmission. Okay. But on LPG, you've got low oil and overheat on the engine and on the transmission.
Now, is it a light or a buzzer?
There's a light and a
Okay.
buzzer. Okay.
The light, you can reset it. So, also, what we've run into is a lot of people writing that engine brake. That really gets the temperature up on the transmission.
Oh yeah, because they're dragging the clutches,
You have
slipping
to
the
learn
clutches.
that when they're selling them, to let these people know that it's not a clutch.
Yep.
It is only to drop your transmission into neutral. So if they keep using it all day as a brake and clutch, that temperature on that thing will go.
It's important that the inching is set properly as well, because if it's not, it doesn't matter if the foot's on there or not, you're going to be slipping against those clutches all day. That's going to create friction, which creates heat. Some drivers, if the inch, depending on how the inching pedal is set, some drivers will, operate with that foot, providing light pressure all the time. And if it's set, a certain way, but not necessarily within spec, it'll cause those clutches to slip, which will cause potentially an overheating issue. At the very least, it'll cause premature failure with the transmissions. So have I baffled you all?